Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second in the series of 3 events marking Women's History Month. The series is called Women of the Holocaust. Today is Mothering Sunday, and I'd like to wish my 2 guests a happy Mother's Day.
And L'chaim to you, L'chaim.
To you all. It's a very special day, and it resonates in different ways for many of us. Many people have not been able to see their families or their mothers, so it is a difficult day. My name is Dame Helen Hyde, and I'm a trustee at the National Holocaust Centre and Museum, and I'm delighted to be here this evening and to be able to introduce to you 2 very special women to be looking at the roles their mothers played during and after the Holocaust, as well as their own roles as mothers today. Very appropriate for Mother's Day. Eva Clarke and Hanneke Dye have spent many years between them speaking at our museum, and they've spoken to thousands of students and adults. And we'd like to say a very big thank you to you both. And we'd like to show our admiration for the strength and tenacity that you've shown in always telling your story in difficult circumstances. So good evening to you both. Thank you for agreeing to participate this evening. And I'm so looking forward to chatting to you both, 3 mothers on Mother's Day. So let's begin. You were both born in difficult circumstances and in different circumstances. So if I can turn to you first, Eva, can I ask you about your mother's pregnancy and your birth? Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, my mother had 2 pregnancies during the war, which is pretty unusual because it was forbidden. If I can explain, my mother was in Theresienstadt for 3 years, from 1941 to 1944. And during that time, as I say, although it was forbidden and the sexes were segregated, she became pregnant. And when the Nazis discovered that she was pregnant, they made my parents sign a document that said that when the baby was born, they would have to be handed over to be killed, because it was forbidden to become pregnant in a concentration camp. And when my parents had to sign this document, they weren't told that the babies would be killed. The word euthanasia was used, and my mother never heard the word, but she had to go and ask somebody what it meant. In the event, my brother was born. He was not taken away from my parents. His name was Jiří, which is George or Dan. But tragically, he died when he was 2 months old of pneumonia. But very strangely, his death meant my life and my mother's life, because had she arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again with me, but it didn't show, it was very early on, so she lived to see another day.
Amazing. But then tell us about where you were actually born and circumstances around that.
Right. So anyway, I hope you understand that I feel morally obliged to give you that bit of background.
Absolutely.
So as I said, my mother was in Theresienstadt for 3 years. She was then sent to Auschwitz. And incredibly, she was one of the people who was sent out of Auschwitz because she was still well able to work. She was a young woman. She was strong. And she and, a whole load of women were sent to a Freiberg, to a slave labor camp, to an armaments factory, where they remained for 6 months. That's from October 44 to the end of March, beginning of April of 1945. And that it was at that moment that the Germans were realizing they were losing the war. And that is when they began to evacuate the camps, because they were trying to empty the camps of living witnesses. And my mother, along with about 2,000 other women, they were put on trains, and these trains didn't consist of cattle trucks this time. They consisted of coal wagons, open to the skies and filthy. And they were sent on a long journey, and it's It's a whole long story, but I'll cut it very short. They were on a train without any food or water, or hardly any water, for 17 days. And they arrived in Mauthausen, which is in Austria, beautiful village on the banks of the Danube, near Linz. And the train arrived in Mauthausen on the 28th of April, 1945. At least, no, on the 29th. And that's a major, major mistake. But anyway, what I want to say is there are three reasons. My mother went into labor when she was on that coal wagon. She had to climb off the coal wagon unaided. She had to get onto a cart because the people who couldn't climb up the hill to the camp, they were pulled up by others.
And she was in labor, Eva. She was in labor during this.
She was in labor. She had, on this cart, she had people lying all over her with typhus and typhoid fever, and she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was a Nazi officer who saw that she was in labor, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been. And she always said that she was screaming, not only because she was in labor, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I have to tell you, my mother at this stage weighed 5 stone, 35 kilograms, and she was 9 months pregnant. And there are three reasons why we survived. And the first one is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April, 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. So presumably had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, I wouldn't be talking to you now. The second indirect reason why we survived was because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckoned she wouldn't have lasted much longer.
Thank you.
This is an incredible piece of film made by a GI on his campaign trail. And my mother and I are the very last images on that. And it was only recently, 5 years ago, found by Wendy Holden, the author of Born Survivors. And I just can't believe it. I mean, I really can't believe this.
It's a marvelous bit of footage and wonderful to see your mother and you.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Can we turn to you, Hanneke, because you were born in very different circumstances. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, done it. Yeah. Yes. My parents lived in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands, and they were married on the 14th of July, 1942, because they realized that the war would not give them a chance to get married otherwise. And it was my mother's brother who really saved the family. And when he heard raids had started in Apeldoorn, he needed to rescue his family. And at that time, my mother's parents, my grandparents, and my parents were hidden in a house nearby of a friend. And Uncle Jaap came and collected first his mother, then his father, then my father, and lastly my mother. And as traveling was very dangerous during the day, because obviously as a Jew you wore your yellow star, they traveled at dusk. And they stopped in the town of Utrecht, where they stayed the night in a private house as the hotels were full. And they when they knocked on the door, because they'd given this address by a waiter from one of the hotels, a lady answered in German. And there was no time to run away as she opened the door. And my uncle thought they had been betrayed. Anyway, the lady had a room and they stayed the night in Utrecht. And they were kept awake most of the night by boots and German voices and soldiers' boots going up and down the stairs. And they found out after the war that the landlady was the girlfriend of a high-ranking German officer.
Goodness.
Anyway, fortunately, they were saved and they arrived at my uncle's home. And then they stayed there for a while. And Uncle Jaap had the task of finding hiding places for my parents. And my mother at that time was 7 months pregnant with me. So he also had the task to find out where this little baby could be born. It would have been too dangerous for a Jewish lady to give birth in a hospital because they probably both would have been taken away. So Uncle Jaap, through his GP, found a midwife, a lady called Mrs. Soontjes, who was prepared to deliver me at her home. And there, on the 10th of February, 1943, in hiding, and that is the picture, only a few hours old, I was born. And it was because of this lady's goodness, risking her own life to help a Jewish lady to deliver me. And we stayed with the midwife for about 10 days, which was really what happened in those days. And then mother breastfed me, and then Uncle Jaap came to fetch me. And she had to go then in hiding, no more breastfeeding, cotton wool and surgical spirit to dry up her breast. And on her way she went. And then Uncle Jaap took me to his house. And my first bed was the leatherette case that housed the Hoover, the vacuum cleaner. And there was sausage shape in those days. So I went on in this leatherette case to Uncle Jaap's house on the back of his bicycle.
But Hanneke,
and that's my story of being born.
Must have been very difficult, Hanneke, for your mother to give you up, even though it was for your
yes.
family. Very, very difficult.
Yes, I think that is a very, very difficult point looking back on it. And of course, I wasn't aware at the time that really the difficulty in our relationship started. To have to give up your baby after 10 days must have been absolutely horrendous.
Sure.
And as a young child, I wouldn't have understood that. It was really until I had children myself that I started to understand what my mother really had gone through.
Yeah, no.
And our relationship, let me start to say first, I loved my mother unconditionally. Each year when I came to live in Great Britain, I went home on my mother's birthday. I missed one. And then when there was the Hidden Child Conference, or there was a Remembrance Day in the town where my father was born, because my father's parents ended up in Auschwitz, as did his sister. And they were refurbishing the monument that they had made there. And obviously I wanted to go to that. And my mother would say to me, "But you only come to Holland for bad things." And it was grossly unfair, of course.
Yeah.
There were lots of little examples where I realized afterwards how difficult the relationship had been. And it wasn't until 2019 that I received a copy of an interview my mother did for the book of the town of Helmond, which was the town where they were hidden. And in this book was their story. And when I asked her about the story, she said to me, "Don't believe everything you read." But when I was in Helmond in 2019, I was given the transcript of her interview for the book. And when you read through it at a certain stage, she says, "I was wondering about the child." And that is, to me, the crux of the matter. It wasn't my child, my baby, it was the child.
I'm going to
she'd only had certain, yeah, fine.
That's a good moment just to stop for a moment. Let's just go to Eva, but I'm going to come back to that, Hanneke.
Yeah.
Eva, your relationship with your mum as you were growing up, can you explain a little bit about that? Because it's very interesting, the contrast, I think, with what we're going to hear with Hanneke. Eva?
Right. Well, I was extremely fortunate. I had a very close relationship with my mother. And I think what must have helped was the fact that she was always able to talk about her wartime experiences. And so I've known my story from a very, very young age, because she would start telling me in very small snippets as she felt I could cope with the details. But when people, especially students, ask me, "Well, do you think you had such a close relationship with your mother because of her experiences in the war? And I said, well, not necessarily. I said, because she had a very close relationship with her mother. So I would have hoped that it would have been, similar. But nevertheless, her experiences must have had something to do with it. And she, I'm very glad to say that we had a very close relationship, and she lived to the ripe old age of 96. And the last 3 years she lived with us here in Cambridge.
Oh.
And also she had a nice sense of humor. When I started to do these talks in schools, she would say, "Oh, great, I don't have to do it anymore."
That sounds very warm and comforting, especially to hear on Mother's Day. Hanneke, I have to come back to you, because for your mum to say "the child" and for you to hear that, carry on telling us a little bit about the effect this had in your relationship.
I think what it was, that my mother came over as rather negative. She was very hospitable, very generous to all of us, and to my grandchildren and to my own children, always very generous. But when I went home, which was normally on the 3rd of March, as her birthday was on the 4th of March, one year we had made up a hamper. My mother was very fond of illy coffee, which was then new, certainly in Britain, but in Holland you could get it sooner. So there was smoked salmon, there was obviously this coffee, and all kinds of really special English things, shortbread, all nice things. And it was in a basket, beautifully wrapped. And my husband and I rang the door. This is early in the morning because we'd come on the boat. And Mother opened the door, and I was there with this beautiful basket. And she said, "Didn't you know the war was over?" And that was so typical of my mother. But then later, when I spoke with my sisters, she would say to her other daughters, I'm the eldest, but to her other daughters, Hanneke gave me such a lovely present, which for some reason she could never say to me. It's only one example, and I don't really want to make my mother look bad, because she was a good woman, but our relationship was difficult. I think the damage that she suffered during the war, the horrors that they experienced, the worry of not seeing her child again, and also being in hiding, not knowing if you were dependent on other people, you were dependent on food, you were dependent on everything, really. And I think that really affected my mother. And also, as soon as the war was over and they were able eventually to go back to Apeldoorn, because the south of the Netherlands was freed long before the other part of the country, her mother was very ill, and she passed away on Boxing Day 1945, a free woman. I think I'll stop there for a moment.
It must have been very, very difficult. So let's turn to our children, your current families. So we go to you, Eva. Tell us about your children, maybe even your grandchildren, your relationship with them, and whether you spoke about or you speak about the events of your birth and what happened. How much do they know?
Right. Well, I have to go back a few years, because my elder son is now, I can't believe it, is now 49, and my younger son will be 46 this year. And I have to say that it was something I felt very badly about during their growing up, during their teenage years. They never, yes, those are my two sons, and at the time I had 3 grandchildren, now I have 4. And during their growing up, they never asked any questions. And because neither my mother nor I wanted to, ram it down your throats, because that's not a way of passing on the history and the memories and that sort of thing. And so they knew far less about it growing up than any of the children of my friends, for example. As adults, they know, and they had a great respect and love for my mother. They knew her very well. And I know once they were adults, and I sort of said to them, why did you never ask anything? And their response was, well, we knew there was something. And I think they were worried about upsetting me or my mother. And I said, well, actually, she was more upset that you didn't ask. But it was just one of those things. And they do both know the story and, but my grandchildren, well, they don't know the story yet. They're much too young. They are only 12 and 10 and 5 at the moment. But on the other hand, as I mentioned this book, Born Survivors, before, there's that photograph you've just seen, that 4-generation photograph of us. It's at the back of this book. And once when I was in Australia, where my younger son lives, and I was speaking in a few schools out there, and my one of my granddaughters said, "Oh, Grandma, are you going to be talking about us?" Because she'd seen that photograph at the end of the book. And I said, yes, of course, but that's all they know. But I have my grandson who lives in London, he is now in year 6. And I know that they do start doing the history of the Second World War in year 6. So Hanneke, you might be interested to know, I gave him a version of the Anne Frank story recently. And also he recently saw the Anne Frank production, which was repeated on the BBC, which I thought was brilliant. So I'm hoping, and he did, he knew my mother, and he sometimes says, well, you seem to be famous, because he's very computer literate as opposed to me. And, he's sort of Googled my mother and things like that, but obviously, he doesn't understand the background or anything. But I don't know if I've answered anything you've asked, Helen.
No, it's been fascinating, because in year 6, the centre run this program on the Kindertransport, and I'm sure, in Oxford, we would do that as well. That's fascinating. What about you, Hanneke? Your grandchildren, your children, how much do they know? Do you talk to them? What's your relationship with them?
Yes, I have 3 children, Miriam, Samuel, and Ruth. And at the end of this year, they will all be in their 50s. Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a shock.
I think the relationship with each one is very good. The relationship between them is maybe not quite how I would wish it. But with the grandchildren, it's a very different story. The grandchildren, what's so nice is that when the schools started doing things about the Holocaust, which isn't really that long ago, but maybe in the early 2000s, one of my granddaughters asked me to speak at her school. It was still before iPads, computers. So they had the questions, and then they take the answers. And also at Holocaust Memorial Day, I was asked to start speaking at schools. But coming back to that event, that obviously made them realize, the younger ones at that stage, that there was something different about me. And last year, not last year because it was COVID, the year before, I was asked to speak at Grassington Festival, which is a festival that happens every year. And it was so oversubscribed, I had to do it twice. So I invited my children and my grandchildren to attend. Now, with one of my daughters, my younger daughter, who studied in Sheffield, I had actually spoken at Sheffield University, so she knew the story. Then my elder daughter was a member of the WI, and she invited me to speak to her WI, so she had heard the story. But this time, also my son heard the story. And story, I think, is actually a wrong word. It's more a testimony.
Yeah.
And then gradually, I actually started coming to the Holocaust, the National Holocaust Educational Center and Museum. And it was a homecoming for me to actually find a place where it was safe to actually talk naturally about the Holocaust and to share it with lots of pupils and other audiences. But coming back to my granddaughters, I am exceedingly proud, not only of my children, but of my granddaughters. 3 of them are at university, and one is at present not quite so well, and she's at home, but we speak very regular. And I'm hoping that my children and my grandchildren are actually listening to both of us, Eva and Helen, because that is my elder daughter with her daughter. She did actually something for the Princess Trust, had all her hair cut off and donated her hair. Hence she looks a little bit bold. And that's Ellen. And she is at Glasgow University.
Hanneke, tell us about the letter or the card you received today for Mother's Day. What did your grandchild...
Yes. Yeah, my elder granddaughter, Anis. This afternoon, there was a ring at the door and a big box arrived, and there's a bouquet of flowers in there with a little card. And very sadly, Anis and Maeve, her sister, have lost their mum a few years ago, who died very, very suddenly. She had an aneurysm, and especially on this day is very sad for them. And Anis thought about her grandmothers, and she sent a bouquet of flowers and a little card where it says, happy grand, between brackets, Mother's Day. I am lucky to have you. Wow. Now, isn't that very, very moving?
Just so beautiful. Ladies. Let's drink to that. Yes. I'm very lucky to have you listen to.
Here's to my family.
Before we actually go back and look at questions from those that are listening to us, is there anything, firstly, Eva, and then I'll come to you, Hanneke, is there anything that about your mother, about your circumstances, that you would just like to share briefly before we go into questions? Eva, is there anything you think we just, it'd be worthwhile listening to and hearing from you?
Oh, you've really stumped me now, Helen. You didn't prepare me for this.
Well, I didn't, but I just thought, the circumstances of your mum, actually, I really want to ask you, your mum goes into labour in a coal truck, and she has to get out of the truck and get into some other vehicle, still in labour, and then she gives birth there.
Yeah.
And then what? Because she's then in Mauthausen. How did she look after you?
Well, I was born at the gates of Mauthausen, and in fact, when I was born, the Germans actually allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner.
Right.
And presumably they allowed it because they could hear the guns in the distance. And the doctor came, and my mother found out afterwards that he actually had been the head of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of, I'm not sure if it was Belgrade, I think it was, at the Bucharest of Belgrade. So he didn't have any medication, he didn't have any equipment, but he knew what he was doing. So he cut the umbilical cord and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And incredibly, my mother actually had, she was able to feed me, which is just remarkable. Weighing 5 stone, she was able to feed me. But then also what is very interesting, and in a sense, no gynecologist has been able to really explain this, when we came back to Prague in the middle of May, my birthday was the end of April, so we came back to Prague in the middle of May, and all her milk dried up. She couldn't feed me.
Amazing. That's a shock, probably.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to ask you that. Hanneke, a hidden child and hidden children. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that the hidden children's stories or testimonies is not one that is very, very commonly heard about. What do you...
I think... sorry, Helen. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Please do.
I think often what is thought of... that people who were in camps, they're worried if those people die, so they want their stories first. And hidden children weren't at one stage thought of as survivors. And I never thought of myself as a survivor until this term came about. But what I wanted to tell you about after my mother died, I had the task as her daughter, even though I lived in England, to tidy up her apartment. And it was at that stage that the world opened to me. There were all the photographs, my parents' wedding photographs, the photograph of me being born, all the other photographs that had never been seen by my sisters or me. And when I opened one of her handbags, in there was a very, very small piece of paper. Mm. And when I opened up that piece of paper, there were two actually, on there was my name, and there were drawings that I did as a very, very young child. There they are, the picture. And my first reaction was, I was exceedingly upset and cross that my mother never had been able to share anything to do with the war with me or my sisters. But then, when I was calmer, I turned it round and I thought, isn't this utterly amazing that Mom had kept this picture all those years, and moreover, that it was me who found this picture. Yeah. And then, of course, mainly, there were so many things. In her possession were 3 tins, for instance. And I normally hold those up to the children and ask them what's in them. And they were given by the British Army when my parents, after they were freed in Holland, which is in the south of the country, so they were freed first, because they tried to do a bit of translation with their school English, they were given 2 tins. One was a silver one, the other one a khaki one, and there were tea rations that the soldiers had. And I hold those up and ask the children to think what's in them, and it's quite interesting. And the third one was actually given by the Americans, and it was Goldflake cigarettes. And amazingly, Goldflake cigarettes are produced in Bristol, a British cigarette, but it was the Americans. And these things were so precious. And also, I have in my possession the dinner service that was used at my parents' wedding in 1942. It was actually my grandparents' dinner service. And it's an English dinner service. So amazing things, isn't it? Yes.
Oh, I think it's I was going to ask you about these hidden papers. Eva, what prompted, this comes from a question somebody was saying with CD, what prompted you to start telling your sons your story? Was it something you had in mind to tell them by a certain time in their lives, or did they start asking you questions?
Well, eventually, when they were older, they started to ask me, and because my mother was, still around, they never actually spoke to her about her experiences, but they did ask me questions. And also, when I was working part-time for the Holocaust Educational Trust in London, I was one of their educators. I used to go on the visits to Auschwitz. And the last time I went, again, I have to tell you, my mother had a lovely sense of humor. Every time I was going to Auschwitz, she would say to me, "Why are you going again?" And I'd say, "Look, it's part of my job. I like to think it's, a way of giving something back." And she would say, "Once was enough for me."
Oh, what a wonderful sense of humor.
Yeah, well, so my son, my elder son, the younger one didn't come because he was in Australia. My elder son came on one of these visits, and obviously he did know a lot of her story by then. And obviously it was very, very moving for both him and me. And he did he asked, "Should he take any photographs?" I said, "Entirely up to you." And then when we came back, and he asked if he should send, he called my mother Nana, if he should send Nana any of these photographs. I said, "Sure, if you want to." I mean, she knew what it was like before and what it looks like now. And she was so moved because she said to me, "She shouldn't exist. I shouldn't exist. He shouldn't exist." And he felt everything was coming, full circle. And she was very pleased.
I can understand from both of you. One of my daughters knows the story in depth and has been with me to the camps, but not the other one. And as a mother, I kind of feel that my mothering will be done once the other one has been with me and knows the story. So it's a difficult thing.
It is. Yes,
talk about relationships and the Holocaust and so on. Yeah. I must tell you what one of your listeners, one of the audience have said. So wonderful to hear your stories. Your mothers were such strong women, and I think you're very strong women. Another question, have either of you, this is the question, ever returned to where you were born? Now, Eva, have you returned to Mauthausen? You've been there?
Yeah. Oh, I've been to Mauthausen several times. At least I also went to Theresienstadt with my mother, and to Mauthausen with my mother. And that was very moving. Obviously, it was very moving because at one time in their visitor center, my mother was on sort of permanent video as being the British survivor. Yeah. And yes, it was extremely moving. She could never go back to Auschwitz because that's where all the family was killed. But she felt able to go to Theresienstadt and to Mauthausen, especially with me, because she said, we won in the end.
Oh, that's a lovely thing. What about you, Hanneke, in Apeldoorn? Or?
Yes, because when my mother gave me up and I was with my uncle, one day my uncle and aunt were out, and the younger aunt, who was 16 at the time, so the sister of my mother, she was babysitting, and I was hidden in the attic, and there was a raid. The Nazis came to the house. They had been tipped off that there were Jews living there. And she was very blonde, so that helped because, as you know, the Nazis thought if you're blonde, you must be Aryan and not Jewish. And quick as a flash, she had a story which said that she was it was a lie. She was orphaned during the bombing of Rotterdam, and therefore she had come to live with her uncle and aunt, and they had told her that Jews lived next door, but that they had fled. So that bit of story now made that it wasn't any more safe for me to stay with Uncle Jaap. So then there was another hiding place, and that was with my foster mother, Sister Pop. And she had a small children's home in Breda. There were also already other Jewish children in her care, and she agreed to take me in. And I was about 6 weeks old when I went there. And my relationship in particular, not only with my uncle and aunt, was very close, but also with Sister Pop, because we lived in the north of the country, Breda's in the south. So each holiday, I went to stay with Uncle Jaap and his family, and I was always taken to Sister Pop. And sometimes I stayed with Sister Pop when she still lived in the children's home, which was a big house. But later, the last time I saw her was when she had moved to a bungalow. She was quite elderly by then, and it was Ash Wednesday. And I had never heard of Ash Wednesday. And there were people walking. Breda is mainly Roman Catholic in those days. And it was Ash Wednesday because people with little silver crosses passed the window and asked her why they were wearing these crosses. And she explained to me that it was Ash Wednesday. And that was the last time I ever saw Sister Pop. But I have a lovely memory of her. Beautiful. Yes. She taught me to walk.
There's another question for you both. Do you feel that you experienced the Holocaust yourself, that you're first generation, or do you feel slightly removed, slightly detached from the experience, and therefore more as second generation survivors? How could you, I think what they want to know is how you would classify yourself, if you can.
Right. Well, I, if you'll forgive the awful pun, I feel I straddle both camps because I am a survivor, but only through an accident of birth. But actually, I am more of a second generation because I don't have any memories.
Yeah.
So that's how I classify myself.
I think that's understandable. What about you, Hanneke?
Well, I've never really thought of it in that way, but like Eva, I was a baby during the war, so I have no actual memory. But still, I don't feel I'm truly second generation. That's the family to come, and I'm hoping that one day when I'm no longer here, that the second generation, one of my daughters, will take up to actually make sure that the hatred and racism that exist not only in Great Britain, but all over the world, that by telling this story and telling what happened during the Holocaust, the 6 million people who lost their life, that will never be forgotten. So my prayer is, like Agnes, that the story will be told, but it will be a story as opposed to a testimony.
Yeah. No, I agree with everything you say, Hanneke. I also hope, but we have to leave it up to our children.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I agree with you both. I think the next generation have to take up the story or the testimony. And we're very lucky at the National Holocaust Centre and Museum because we've got testimonies, we've heard you, we've got various ways of showing it. So is there anything else that you'd like to say, or I'm just going to check the questions. Yeah, I've got Hanneke. Is your story in the book, The Hidden Children, Secret Survivors of the Holocaust by Jane Marks? I read it about 20 years ago. Is your story in that book?
Unfortunately, I've never written my story because I feel unless I have actual dates and can be precise, I'm slightly worried how really true this story is going to be. If you put something in print, it has to be accurate for me. I'm not in that book, but the person who was in that book, Nicole David, it was through her that I went to the Hidden Child Conference in the Netherlands, where I met 2 people who had also been with Sister Pop during the war.
Oh, wow.
And that's in itself amazing because they could tell me things from when I was a little baby that my mother couldn't tell me, although she wouldn't tell me much anyway, but even so. And they actually told me that our hair was bleached, which I already touched upon earlier, and indeed that they had been frightened of the 2 dogs that Sister Pop had. They were older than me, but because the dogs were protective of this little baby, and when they barked, they had been frightened. And the most interesting thing they told me was that there was a little boy who was also with Sister Pop, and his father was a German soldier who was very fond of children and regularly visited his son and used to pick me up as the youngest, put me on his knee, and actually sang nursery rhymes to share with the children. So there weren't only Nazis, there were also good people.
Yeah.
So before we actually end, teaching of the Holocaust to students, to adults now, what's your view? Should we continue teaching about it, or should we just let it become history? So we start with you, Eva, briefly, and then I'll go to Hanneke.
Well, I definitely feel that the history of the Holocaust should be continued to be taught. And for as long as there are survivors of the Holocaust, I think they are invaluable in giving their testimony. And then I think that once they are no longer with us, that either children or grandchildren can tell their parents, their grandparents' story with, as long as they use all the correct facts, the historical facts, obviously. But I definitely think it should be, because I imagine, Hanneke, you agree with me. I think that we all do this, not only as a memorial to what happened in the Holocaust, but also to try to do our level best to counteract any form of racism and prejudice. Because, this is what happens. It started very gradually, but this is the horrendous and, I hate to say it, but logical outcome of racism and prejudice.
Absolutely.
And I think we all have a duty to prevent it as far as we can.
Hanneke, your view.
I totally and utterly agree with you, Eva. I feel privileged to be able to come to the Holocaust Center and share the sadness that happened, the horrors that happened, but also to make the students understand. At one time, they would play in the playground and you would say, don't bully each other, be kind to each other. Now you say don't have cyberbullying. And I asked them to have respect for each other. And by having respect and not having hatred, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or whatever religion, the color of your skin, or where you come from. We are all human beings, and together we can make a better world. And the reason why I do my talk is, it is out of duty, exactly as you say, Eva, but it's my little step towards peace in the world.
Now I'm going to ask you one final question each.
Mm-hmm.
If you could ask your mothers one question, and you don't have to answer this because we've tried this. If you could ask your mothers one question, what would it be, Eva? And if it's too hard...
No, it's not that... I mean, ever since my mother died, I've thought of lots of questions I wish I had asked her, but there isn't one sort of overriding one.
No.
You know, I'm sorry, I really can't answer that.
That's fine. It's just, it comes to mind. Hanneke, what about you?
I would ask my mother, why weren't you able to share the horrors that you went through with us? So we would have much more understanding of you as a human being, and I would have more understood the relationship between you and me. Mommy, I love you, I truly do, but it's such a lack in my life that you never were able to share the war with us.
Well, on that note, firstly, I think we'll draw to a close. And in closing, I'd like to thank the Jewish Chronicle for partnering this series of events. I'd like to thank all of you watching this evening and those of you sending in your comments and questions. But really, from me, a real thank you to my two dear friends now, Eva and Hanneke. We've had a wonderful time preparing this, and it's been humbling to me to hear your stories again. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you all for listening. Next event is on Wednesday, the 24th of March. The National Holocaust Center and Museum Director, Mark Cave, will be interviewing Kitty Mauthausen, OBE, about how she and her mother survived the Holocaust. I hope you'll join us to hear her remarkable story. Again, Eva and Hanneke, thank you so much for being with us. A happy Mother's Day. Hope you have a very pleasant evening.
And we thank you. I'm sure I can speak for Hanneke. We thank you and for everybody at what I call Beth Shalom.
Sure. Well, we'll meet in the flesh soon. So thank you all. Until then, stay safe and well. Have a vaccine as soon as you can. Thank you all again for your support.
Thank you.
Good health. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.